So, what I'd like to do now is to introduce Mark Shuttleworth. So Mark, if you could come on down. Mark is the founder of Ubuntu, an entrepreneur, a visionary, an investor, and an Isle of Man resident. Now, I was actually born and raised on the Isle of Man, so it's one of those funny little things. And most importantly, he is a leader in our industry. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mark, and please show our appreciation. Mark, over to you.
This is actually the biggest week in the Isle of Man calendar. How many folks here have heard of the TT race? It's the oldest motorcycling race and still the most insane motorcycling race in the world. 36,000 people went to the Isle of Man this week. So I'm very grateful for the invitation not to be there. But it is a blast. If you ever get the chance, I can highly recommend it. Right, so let me, I've got a demo going here, so let me colonize one of these. Is that going to work? If I talk from here, is that coming through? Yeah? All right, great. So, first I'll play AV Guy. And let's dive in. So the perspective that I wanted to share today, thank you. The perspective that I wanted to share today is backed by what we see happening in cloud computing. Obviously, that is the back-end infrastructure that is driving all of the extraordinary things we see on the front end, on devices and for consumer services. We are entering a time, sort of congratulations, you've all won the lottery. You know something about software. And we're entering a time when the world is defined by software. Software-defined everything. It's not software-defined data centers or software-defined networks. It's software-defined everything. Imagine a world in about 10 years' time when Uber can have a fleet of cars that drive themselves, right? What is going to define that business? It's going to be software. Software will place the cars, in the right places to get the most efficient kind of predicted ride volume, and software will drive the cars. We're entering into a completely software-defined space. And you guys are right at the center of one of the most interesting aspects of software itself, right? Communications define the human experience, and so your innovation is, I think, going to be absolutely, you're going to see explosive growth for your ideas over the next 5 to 10 years. We're also entering a time of really interesting complexity from a developer perspective. Distributed systems are hard. A system that is spread across 10 different computing systems is 1,000 times more complex than a system that's running on one system. We used to say that threaded development, multi-process, concurrent development, that was hard. But now we're seeing concurrent software running in highly distributed environments. And that makes things much, much more interesting, right? So all of the interesting software today is distributed. And even if you don't think your application's distributed, right, think of all the ways you're dependent on other things happening in the network, other tools working in the network. And so what fascinates me, what I spend a lot of time on at the moment, is things that make distributed systems easier, more tractable, and things that solve the business problems associated with distributed systems. So just in terms of perspective, most people choose Ubuntu in cloud. On the public cloud, it's about 60 to 70% of the guests, depending on the cloud in question. And for private cloud, people are typically converging on vCloud and OpenStack as the two sort of legs of their private cloud strategy. And the substantial majority of all of the OpenStack deployments in production are on Ubuntu. This is the official OpenStack survey. And the general meme there is scale out, right? Ubuntu's become the platform for scale out computing. And we put a lot of work into being a great platform for developers who are building these distributed, scale out oriented applications. Telcos happen to be a particular focus of ours at the moment. So we spend a lot of time understanding the telco environment, constraints, and vision, right? All of these telcos that are working with us want to essentially reset the network around something much leaner, much cleaner, much more 21st century. And of course, OpenStack is at the heart of that. Deutsche Telekom building their next generation network with us. Time Warner, which is a media business, but increasingly media businesses are in the highly connected media world, and so that infrastructure is all about communications. NEC, a telco equipment provider, NTT, another big telco, all doing deep R&D with us. So we have good visibility in what people are doing. I put this slide in because heterogeneity is a reality. There is no single technology, there's no single tool, there's no single operating system, there's no single platform that is going to sort of wipe everything else out. And just as soon as one thing starts to get a lot of momentum, the next thing comes along behind it. So that's something we hold very deeply, and we do a lot of work with other platforms, essentially, to be heterogeneous. And this, for me, is what it's really all about. It's about innovation on top of a platform. And these are all guys who are doing pretty amazing things with Ubuntu at scale, and particularly focused on scale and scale out. Now, this is the picture that I think most people don't really appreciate. Most people in IT don't really appreciate. It's a reflection of the difference, the essential difference between guys who know how to operate at scale and people who don't. This represents the number of physical servers for each human in the system administration team of the company. At Facebook, the number is 24,000 to 1. So one human being is tending and feeding 24,000 physical servers. That's about 6 seconds per server per year per person, right? You can't even load a web page and click on something at that time. So obviously, automation becomes absolutely central to any sort of operation at scale. But automation, I think, is important for a bunch of other reasons as well. As you get into cloud operations, you have to fundamentally change every aspect of your operation, right? You have to change the way you develop your software. You have to change the way you sell your software. You have to change the way you update and manage your software. And it's really, I think, the interesting stuff for me is understanding what the great practitioners are doing when they're operating at scale. Companies like Netflix, the way Netflix publishes their software, the way they update it, the way they develop it, is really interesting. But they were just the first pioneer, and already we see the state of the art moving on from there. So I want to also talk a little bit about business models, right? So there's how we build the software, but then there's also how we sell the software. And today, I think the enterprise software world generally, and telcos are sort of especially excruciating example of this, the enterprise software world generally is deeply broken. A small team of 4 or 5 hackers can make something interesting, make something useful pretty quickly. You guys can relate to that, right? You can break out from your current secure environment and go make something really, really interesting. The hard part then becomes essentially the sales process and the integration process for that solution. And if you think back, 10 years to the world of consumer software, it was the same. You could make a piece of consumer software, but then selling it was really quite challenging. You had to put it in boxes, and you had to get people to put the boxes on shelves. And so you were sort of enormously removed from the people who are actually just installing and using and deriving benefit from that software. Today in the consumer world, that sales process is much more efficient. Users hear about a piece of software, they find it in an app store, they click on it, and they're running it. It's an immediate, there's a tremendous improvement in the immediacy of the relationship between the developers of that software and their users, their consumers. But in enterprise software, we still have this very broken sales process and this very broken sort of integration process. And that's where I'm interested in transforming things. That's where I think we can learn from the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons and make that kind of automation available and learn from the Apples of the world, make that kind of integration and experience available for enterprise software. So this is the tool that we work on for transforming the world of back-end software in the cloud. This is an old screenshot of something produced by Juju. Juju is a real-time integration and real-time orchestration system. So what does it do? It was born on EC2. It was born out of the observation that we had that all the startups we were working with were duplicating effort left, right, and center. So we noticed very, very early that Ubuntu was super popular on EC2. And we put in place a little program to go and talk to the people who are using EC2 and understand like where their pain points were and what we had to fix. And we found that Ubuntu, like all versions of Linux at the time, was designed to be installed on a server that would sit there for 10 years and nobody wanted to touch it for 10 years. And so it had all these assumptions baked into it that just turned out not to be true when you were operating on the cloud. And so we spent a lot of time then fixing those things so that Ubuntu is super easy to spin up at scale. And that's really why developers like Ubuntu so much. So once we'd fixed that first crop of problems, we then we kept working with those startups, those developers, and we noticed that they all had whiteboards up in their offices, and whiteboards were like boxes connected by lines, and the boxes all had the same names on them, right? It was, in today's language, Hadoop and Cassandra and Logstash and Elasticsearch and Kibana and useful tools. But all of those developers were essentially recreating from scratch the automation to deploy that stuff in their environment on EC2. And so we set about trying to figure out how to enable sharing. Just like we share packages in Ubuntu, we do the work once and then anybody can just apt-get and instantly have a piece of software. We wanted to share not just the software, but the operational story around that software as well. How you install it, how you scale it, how you monitor it, how you integrate it. And turn that into open source software that anybody could just use and reuse. And so that's what Juju does, right? It's not a specific application at all, right? But it enables the integration and scaling and updating and management of any application. So this was the winning entry in a competition we had to see what people could do with Juju as it was about a year ago. And I'll show you a little bit about what you can do with it today, and particularly in the telco space. So going to go to jujucharms.com. This is a blank canvas over here. It's not backed by any cloud, but that canvas could be backed by EC2, Azure, Rackspace, HP Cloud, any OpenStack cloud. You can do physical provisioning. So here you'll see later there's a session where we will do physical provisioning with Juju, building OpenStack clouds, but also building out big data or anything of yours that needs to be orchestrated on bare metal as well. So that canvas can have anything on it. And since we're in Telco Central here, let's do a little bit of telco stuff. So here is a zip file which contains Juju Charms. Charms are sort of the nugget, the package essentially that Juju uses to do all of this. And I'm dragging and dropping something here because this is not open source software, right? This is RESTCOM. So that's how we would spin up RESTCOM on a single machine. This is how we would spin up the load balancer. And this is how we would integrate them. It's terribly difficult, as you can see. But more interestingly, this is how we'd scale it. Oh, I've got it the wrong way around, no wonder. Here we go. There's 1 unit there now. I'm just going to go ask the cloud for 10. And so with that simple operation, I've essentially said update the model so that there should be 10 units, whatever a unit is in this cloud, of that application. And now the load balancer will be told to scale over 10. So that's nice. I can actually build pieces from scratch really, really quite efficiently. What if I wanted to do sort of a whole cluster of those things? Well, this is a bundle, although someone suggested we should call it a bracelet because charms and bracelets sound about right. Well, this is Clearwater. Do you guys know what Clearwater is, right? IMS, so it's a telco, big piece of telco infrastructure. This is from Metaswitch, and that is how you would deploy in a cloud environment Metaswitch. Juju would now be talking to the cloud, spinning up all the machines that are required, getting the operating systems up and running, so it asks for machines with the right operating system, installing all the applications, and integrating them. And then I can go and scale any individual piece of that. I could also go and take, let me just move that to one side. I could go and take this piece of software. Who knows what this is? A mesh. I think that's from Teatro, right? There we go. So that's one piece from Teatro, and here's another piece from Teatro. And again, these are just zip files that somebody could have pushed straight out of GitHub and sent to the customer. And hopefully by this weekend, by the end of the weekend, we'll be able to take these pieces, which I can connect to each other, and we'd be able to connect them to Clearwater. So what this is doing is completely changing the way you would think about the sales cycle, changing the way you would think about the integration process, changing the way your customers might think about the integration process. Right now, we're building clouds with a very long list of telcos. And the focus of that cloud, essentially, is to accelerate the development and testing of their next-generation networks. What we're starting to see is that the guys who are responsible for those projects now want to accelerate their evaluation of your stuff, right? They're saying, okay, we're interested in this NFV. We're interested in essentially being able to integrate, to assess, integrate, and operate interesting, innovative solutions much, much faster than we ever have been able to do so before. And so the idea is to be able to offer them instant access to any of your stuff, right? So you don't have to go through long RFP processes, and you don't have to go through long systems integration processes. You're able to innovate, focus your resources on the innovation, and then you're able to get the fastest possible adoption of those pieces as easily as possible. So there are folks here, there'll be a session later today, I think, about this. If you want to see what a charm looks like, let me just go into, say, the MySQL charm. It's super easy. Go have a look at the code. And you'll see it's just a collection of, files, some lightweight metadata, and then a series of hooks, which are just scripts or binaries that are run as events happen, as this model changes, right? So as MySQL learns that it needs to talk to WordPress, or it needs to talk to a monitoring solution, or it needs to talk to something else, each of these scripts in turn are run. And those can be written in any language. They can use Puppet, Chef, traditional configuration management stories. So this service orchestration story is a level up from your traditional configuration management. You can integrate your existing configuration management stuff in there, or you can just write them in Shell, Bash, Python, whatever suits. So super easy. And charms declare what interfaces they will support. So I can't connect this thing to anything on this page because nothing that's it's not already connected to declares that it supports the interfaces that this thing would talk. So essentially you declare what you want to be able to talk to, and then that lets you essentially plug into and reuse those pieces very, very easily. Okay. So if we can, there was a great comment at the recent OpenStack Summit where someone said it used to be you wanted to have things either cheap, fast, or good, and you could pick any two. But it turns out that if you can get stuff fast, then you can effectively substitute for cheap, and you can substitute for good, right? You can substitute for good through iteration. In other words, if you can get stuff up and running faster, then you can make it better more easily because you can iterate quickly. And you can substitute for cheap because if you can go faster, you can drive revenue faster, which means that you can essentially substitute for cheap. These are guys who are currently either consuming charms or creating charms. IBM also just hopped on board with a core team of Juju developers and will be charming up all of their solutions and using it with third-party software as well for integration purposes. We showed Juju working with Windows at the OpenStack Summit. So we see that going completely cross-platform. It's coming to other versions of Linux as well. So there's no constraint on Ubuntu or lock to Ubuntu. what our interest is in building the largest possible collection of charms. The more charms there are for Ubuntu, the more use Ubuntu will get in the cloud. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap there because I believe we have time for questions. Do we have time for questions, Alan?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mark.
Let's do that. Thank you.
So do we have any questions for Mark from the Madrid audience? Oh, here we go. There's always a troublemaker.
Excellent presentation. Really interesting to know what the business model is here, or how do you expect to make money? I know it's kind of a general question, but how do you then take that to the business market?
So our relationships with public clouds typically compensate us for folks' use of Ubuntu. In other words, we're motivated to make Ubuntu amazing on that public cloud. So we optimize it for the cloud. We spend a lot of time making sure that if you use Ubuntu on that cloud, you get a great experience. Obviously, then the easier we can make it for people to drop Ubuntu onto the cloud and scale it, the better. People aren't having any trouble with that. Like, so 70% of what's running on those public clouds today is Ubuntu. But we've got our eye on the next wave. Nobody ever asks, when you see those boxes up on the screen, nobody ever asks what operating system is in, right? Could be CentOS, could be Windows. Nobody ever asks. And I think that what we'll see is we'll see a shift from the world which was driven by the physical world, where you bought some tin and then you put an operating system on the tin, and then your application had to be certified on that operating system, right? To things going exactly the other way around, where you choose your application and it pulls everything it needs with it, right? So that's why we're sort of so focused on this idea that users should be able to choose their application. And the vast majority of the stuff that's going to be running out there will be free software, will be open source software. So just by having all of those charms be Ubuntu, we're essentially making it easier for people to glue the stuff together that they want with Ubuntu. And if there's a vendor that has a piece of software on RHEL and you drag and drop their application on there and you've just bought RHEL in the process, that's fine by us. It's a big wide world. But by essentially leading the process, we make sure that the sort of core glue infrastructure is all on Ubuntu, where people want it anyway because it works really well.
Okay, I'm not getting any questions from the satellites at the moment, but we did a pre-event questionnaire, and we had some excellent questions from there, so I'll ask one, a little bit more general, rather than Ubuntu focused. As a successful technology entrepreneur, we have a lot of students in the audience, so they'd like to get some advice, recommendations from you, Mark, in terms of what should they do in helping them become successful technology entrepreneurs like yourself.
So my response to that question is always a combination of two things. First, know the time that you're living in, right? Because what worked 5 years ago certainly isn't going to work. What you see in the headlines today is not the recipe for success, because what you see in the headlines today is the product of choices made 3-5 years ago, right? So certainly never chase the headlines. Try to understand what's really going on over the next 3 to 5 years. And then of all of that, choose the stuff that you enjoy, because it's just no fun. And entrepreneurship is really intense. How many of you folks here would consider yourself to be entrepreneurs? Great. And I hope you'll agree, it's really intense. It teaches you a huge amount about everything in life, about why, much more than simply the product or the code. So you really have to be passionate about the product to thrive.
Exactly. Any more questions from the Madrid audience? If not, let's show appreciation for Mark for an excellent presentation, demonstration, and questions.
Thank you very much.